I think it's great that the facilitation schedule today had you all standing up right after lunch so you're awake. And I'm going to contribute to that as well with a bunch of funky or silly or goofy pictures to help tell my story. I am a consultant with the Georgetown Climate Center. They let me put their logo on the slide along with my goofy pictures, and I'm grateful for that. The modeling that we did is relatively straightforward. We did really two things. We asked ourselves, what will happen to North Carolina's electricity sector if no additional action is taken? We call that the business as usual scenario. And then we did another run where we asked ourselves, what if North Carolina were to adopt an electricity sector cap? And how do those two things compare? We were inspired by Virginia. Some of you may know Virginia recently finalized a rule to adopt an electricity sector cap. And they essentially were doing what you're doing today and have been doing throughout this process. They looked at the power sector for opportunities to decarbonize, essentially. They realized that what they expected from their power sector were flat emissions. In other words, if they didn't do anything or take additional action, emissions were not going to decrease. And so they asked themselves, what should we do? And they decided that they would cap and reduce emissions from their power sector and link it to RGGI. And at the time, RGGI looked a bit like this picture. It now is bigger already. They started with the governor's executive order, and the order directed DEQ to develop the design of a program and model. And Georgetown Climate Center did the modeling for the state in that effort. And what we did for looking at the same question in North Carolina took the same exact approach as Virginia took. So when I say we were inspired by Virginia, we sort of followed the same rules, and that made things very simple. In addition to doing modeling and thinking about the design, they did talk to RGGI, and they asked RGGI, what would it take for us to link up to this larger program, because we think costs will be lower if we do that, and we'll make a bigger impact. And they said, we want you to have a comparable design, a comparable ambition, and we want you to sort of follow the same administrative process that we use for making changes to the program over time. And so Virginia ended up doing a rulemaking that was based on the RGGI model rule, and they have committed to administering the program very similar to the rest of the RGGI states. And so they have a rule that is going to be linked to RGGI. And with that, we have a different looking RGGI today as we stand here. We have, it's weird the colors don't show up exactly the same. New Jersey and Virginia, their status is pending. They're going to be adopting a program or have adopted a program, and will link to the rest of the states. And then you may have noticed that the Pennsylvania governor has also publicly said he's directed his folks to examine this same path for Pennsylvania. So that's under consideration. And our modeling effort really just asks, hypothetically and in the abstract, what if North Carolina did the same? We didn't think it was too crazy to start wondering this because of the reason you're all here, which is the Executive Order 80. And the first question we asked ourselves was, what does the sector look like if there are no additional actions? And lo and behold, we found the same thing that Virginia found, which is emissions are likely to be flat, which suggests that without additional actions, there won't be reductions. I'm trying to stick to a story here, but part of the story is about the technical basis of the analysis, and that is we used ICF's integrated planning model, or IPM. We used that because it was used by RGGI, and we thought that the results would be nicely comparable between what RGGI does and what we did here. It's also what the tack that Virginia took. But it happens that it's also the model that EPA uses, that most utilities use for one purpose or another, and that NRDC uses. And Amanda is going to tell us about what the results that they got. We also used all of the same assumptions that RGGI used. So again, We wanted the results to be apples to apples comparisons. And we did include the solar mandates from North Carolina statute and some North Carolina specific inputs on retirements and new builds. So what did we see? In a business as usual sense, what we saw is that solar is a really good option for North Carolina's system. In fact, it's so good that the model suggested it was economical to build 3 gigawatts more than are required by HB 589. Gas is cheap, we all know that, and the model tells us left to just the economics, gas would also increase in terms of capacity beyond what's planned by Duke in this time frame. And then coal capacity, we found by 2030 was going to drop some as a business as usual matter by 3.9 gigawatts. And that's a combination of planned retirements and economic retirements. So that's the business as usual, and then we take the business as usual and we compare it to what we expect to happen if there's a cap. And just so you know, we applied the RGGI cap essentially, which in this case we started in 2022 because we figured that's how long it would take to do something in North Carolina. And then that's not a comment about how long. It just, even with the average state rulemaking process, it would take this long in any state. So there was no slight in that. I'm being very careful. All right, so it would start in 2022. It would decline 3% per year for 10 years, so that the decline wouldn't end until the end of 2031. And it has basically all the same features of RGGI, including cost management features. And what you see is there's quite a reduction. We found that because of the availability of cost-effective reductions in North Carolina, reductions were greater than what the cap requires. And which means North Carolina would be selling reductions to the other states that the state is linked to. It was, I don't want to overstate that, it was modest. The cumulative reductions were 32% on a cumulative basis, whereas the cap brought us to 27% by the end of 2030. So an additional 5% when talking about cumulative reductions. With capacity, we saw, I guess the general comment to make is this didn't have a huge effect on the system. I mean, I'm always cautious about using subjective terms that attempt to characterize results. Like you can make that decision for yourself. But considering a reduction of 30%, what we see here is not a huge difference. A little bit less gas is built, a little bit more solar is built in the presence of a cap. Generation, a little bit less gas, quite a bit less coal generation. We didn't see any coal retirements caused by the cap, so the plants still were there, they just ran less. And a bit more solar. And I want to note that one of the reasons the bar on the right, which represents 2030 under the cap, is shorter than the bar on the left, is imports did increase. So one of the ways that the model chose to comply with the cap is to bring in more imports, which is an issue. How much does it cost? These bars put the business as usual cost next to the cap cost on a wholesale basis. I'll let you decide whether those are large changes. I will say that these are wholesale price impacts, which when translated to retail, shrink, because wholesale energy price is just a fraction of the retail bill, especially for residential. It's a bigger fraction for industry, somewhat less, smaller fraction for commercial, and so on. And this doesn't take into account that allowance value could be used to rebate to customers, or in another way that has that same effect. Allocation to a vertically integrated utility, for example, would have that same effect. And then one of the key points to ask the question, how hard would it be for North Carolina to negotiate with RGGI that they could link? A key question there is, well, what does it do to allowance prices? How do allowance prices change? And the pre-North Carolina cap line is on the top, so that's what RGGI prices were before, and without North Carolina, and the North Carolina adds a cap and links to RGGI is below. So the price drops when you add North Carolina, which means, there are more low-cost reductions in North Carolina than there are in the states that it's linking to. But they're pretty close. The prices are very close, which suggests the negotiation to link up with RGGI would be relatively straightforward. So, two big conclusions. Based on the business as usual analysis, we conclude that if you want reductions in the sector, you need new measures. They won't happen on their own. And number two, a declining cap, similar to that which Virginia did, might be a good option to consider. That's it.
Great, thank you so much. As a reminder, we're going to have Q&A following Amanda, so make sure to jot down questions that you have.
So my slide deck is not nearly as artistic, so I apologize, this could be a lot more boring. But what I do want to start off with is we did our own IPM modeling. It's a little tiny bit different than what Franz just presented, and I think that's important to understand, is we have different assumptions. Our assumptions reflect kind of how we think of the world in 2019. So we did update our assumption deck not to match RGGI, but just to kind of represent what was publicly available by March of 2019. So everything has been updated to kind of EIA's projections for 2019 and beyond. And that's going to explain a few of the differences between kind of what our model is spitting out versus Franz's. Though in many cases, they're very, very similar. All of these slide decks will be presented or uploaded. So there's a lot of slides in here. I'm not going to go through them all. If you have any questions afterwards, feel free to email me. My email is at the bottom, I believe, of most of the slide deck. But what we did is we ran a variety of scenarios. So we looked at a BAU. We actually modeled two different types of BAU. We had one where we called it our optimized, where we just let the model solve. What is the cheapest path forward for North Carolina? It means coal retirements. We don't see any new gas, and instead we see a lot of solar and some battery storage coming online over the next decade. We then did an IRP-like business as usual, where we forced in some of those natural gas plans from Duke's most recent IRP to understand if we do make these new investments in natural gas that are in line with kind of what Duke is projecting it needs to meet its capacity and energy needs, what does the system look like? What are emissions? What are the costs? To have a more potentially, a slightly different BAU that might reflect the direction that the utility and the state are kind of headed in, at least according to the most recent needs. And then we had three different types of policies. One, just clean energy. What if we strengthen the state's energy efficiency resource standard and we increase the state's renewable portfolio standard to 30% by 2030? What does that do to emissions? And then we compared it to a RGGI-like approach. We have one big difference in terms of how we did RGGI versus how Franz modeled RGGI. We prevented the model from increasing imports beyond kind of business as usual levels as a measure of compliance. We originally did run RGGI without kind of that import restriction, and we did see the model choosing quite a bit of imports as a way to comply with RGGI. And we wanted to understand, if we don't allow that to happen, what does it mean? So all of the kind of things that I'll show here are going to include that import restriction, and that's going to explain a few of the differences, especially between our RGGI-like runs. And then we combine those two policies. What if we have RGGI, we cap carbon, but we also pass policies that promote energy efficiency or promote renewable energy? What does that do to prices? What does that do to emissions? And what does that do to the state's generation and capacity mix? I'm going to completely skip this slide if you have any questions. My assumptions are there. And here are gas prices. Also, just they're low. That's what you need to know. So here's what it means. Emissions. While emissions drop between now and 2020, they are pretty much flat in BAU between 2020 and 2035. So we are seeing flat emissions over the next couple of years, so it is lower than historical emissions. One thing to note is that in our IRP and optimized BAU, we're actually seeing emissions increase slightly, between 2020 and 2035, after an initial drop in 2020 as some of those really uneconomic coal units turn off or are run even less than they are today. But we do see that joining RGGI, and especially joining RGGI and also passing the energy efficiency standards or strengthening energy efficiency targets, and promoting renewable energy by strengthening renewable energy standards can have a significant impact on emissions and really cut emissions not only beyond what the economy-wide target for Executive Order 80 is, but you can cost-effectively achieve a lot more. Under our RGGI plus clean energy scenario, we're able to cut emissions by 52% compared to 2005 levels by 2025, and they are 60% lower by 2030. So there's a huge potential for the power sector to do a lot more just by promoting renewables, capping carbon, and investing in energy efficiency, all things that we've been discussing here today. And I'm just going to quickly run through the next couple of slides to show you what's happening to the state. In 2030, we see a lot of solar being built, whether due to policies or just pure economics. By 2030, we have about 8 gigawatts compared to the 5.7 gigawatts being built in the state of North Carolina. And we also see 1 to 2 gigawatts of storage being built to help integrate those renewables reliably. The storage is taking the place of some of those natural gas plants in Franz's model, and we aren't seeing new gas being built, except for in our kind of IRP-like case where we're forcing in those natural gas plants. And in all cases, whether it's BAU or our policy cases, we see a significant reduction in coal. But RGGI itself does not result in significant coal retirements beyond BAU. You're able to kind of meet the goals of RGGI just by changing the way that you run your system as it is expected to look like under our model in BAU, and investing in a little tiny bit more solar, whether driven by policies or just the RGGI price. And this is just kind of shows you compared to BAU. You see a lot more solar by 2030, quite a bit more solar by 2025, and also that battery storage coming online as a result of the increased amount of solar. And then, again, this just kind of shows you generation. In all cases, imports are pretty minimal. In the clean energy case, where all we're doing is adding energy efficiency and adding renewables, we actually see that the state becomes a net exporter of power. So investing in solar, investing in energy efficiency can create a more diverse, low carbon resource, but it can also even reduce the need to import any electricity, at least from a net perspective, if done right. And again, most of these slides are going to be on the web, so I'm going to just finish with this slide, which shows you bill impacts. And this is kind of compared to just an IRP BAU. I think the main driver here is by 2030, we see bill savings for residential customers under a RGGI or combined clean energy RGGI or just clean energy approach. Investing in renewables, investing in low carbon technologies will result in lower bills over time as those investments kind of help not only reduce emissions, but also reduce fuel costs and other spending over time. And so you can have both an economic and environmental kind of benefit when pairing especially the RGGI and clean energy policies together to go beyond what the economy-wide goal of Executive Order 80 is, and really highlight and take advantage of the fact that the power sector is the quickest and cheapest source of carbon reductions. Perfect.
With time to spare, that means we will have about 7 minutes for Q&A with our two speakers. I think I'm going to ask you all to just speak really loudly. Oh, they're back to run the mics. So raise your hand if you have a question, and our staff will come find you with a microphone.
Thanks, Dave Rogers here. I have one question for both of y'all. You talked about that kind of import issue, I assume, from coming in from PJM, and then you talked about it overall. But did y'all happen to look at at the hourly level? So you might be a net exporter, but if you're importing a ton of energy, say on January 1st at 7 in the morning, might not make sense transmission-wise, so I'd be curious if you both could kind of respond to the constraints in terms of imports on like an hourly basis.
One microphone up here.
No, we didn't look. I don't know what I did, I'm sorry. The model does look at that level of detail, but we didn't dig into the results to that degree.
Yeah, it's very similar, which is, that does exist, the model is taking that into account, so it can't exceed what is available via transmission in any given hour. So that's reflected, but we don't have that hourly by hourly data.
Greg Monty, that last graph that was just up there, there was increased pricing, billing in 2025, a major spike. What's the general reason for that?
So that's being driven by the RPS requirement. So that includes the rec prices and all the other elements that are part of a retail bill. It is, it looks like a pretty drastic spike. It could be averaged out, and it's still only about 3%. And it's just kind of an approximation, but it's being driven mostly by the RPS, which is kind of just setting higher rec compliance costs.
A couple questions on this side of the room.
Hi, Steve Calland. So both models show quite a bit of solar capacity being added or generation being added, and what we're starting to see kind of on the ground is a lot of barriers to construction of solar in the state. This kind of assumes frictionless development of solar, if you will. Not a lot of barriers on siting, land use, that sort of thing, interconnection policy, so on, just straight economics. If we run into problems with solar being blocked by, in essence, these other types of issues, where does the model go? What does it shift to?
I think it will depend on if there are other policies in play. So if we had, for example, the RGGI policy or a clean energy policy in play, and there were barriers, there are two solutions that the model might choose. One is it would locate that solar somewhere else. So maybe instead of building 8 gigawatts in North Carolina, it's going to build a few in Virginia, a few in Tennessee, a few in South Carolina.
It would show up as imports and that.
And it would show up as imports. It may also choose to build another, if there's an energy need, I think it would tend to choose another form of renewable, whether it's wind and then try to transport it by wire, and it really will be imports. If there's a capacity need, it could choose to build additional gas as a replacement.
That's what I was going to say. I think we can't answer the question really without actually doing the run, so that's a caveat. But I suspect gas would be an obvious option, at least in our runs, because we were building more gas than Dominion has planned because of low natural gas prices, which suggests to me that solar and gas were the two that the model seemed to be toggling between. So I bet we'd see more gas if we didn't have the solar.
We have one here in the middle.
I noticed on Amanda's slide in her analysis, and it probably was in Franz as well, although I couldn't tell, that the existing nuclear generation continued at a constant level out into the future. And I wondered if you considered or modeled in case there isn't a second life extension for existing nuclear, if you looked at that, and if so, what were the results of that on the overall model?
Right, so our model includes an 80-year extension. We assume that the cost of an 80-year extension is the same cost that the 40 to 60-year was. So that is being factored in. The model is keeping that nuclear online and extended, at least in North Carolina, though it does not do that for every facility. So that is factored into our analysis. Up to 80 years.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that. I mean, the existing nuclear is playing a potentially big role here because it's carbon-free, and it's a big chunk of the generation and the capacity. We've done runs like that in other states where we've taken the nuclear out, and it really varies, in part because gas is really cheap. So if it varies in terms of the effect it has on the cost of the program. It tends to, if you take the nuclear out, it makes the program more expensive. But how much more expensive really depends on what you're replacing that with. And because gas is so cheap, you know, it hasn't turned out to be so costly like I might have thought it would be when you take nuclear out. But it definitely plays a really important role, the nuclear.
Great, that's all the time we have for questions right now, so hold your additional questions for our speakers at the next break.